Welcome back to another episode of The State of Sustainability. On this episode, we are going to talk about plant-based proteins. This was originally conceived as an episode on alternative proteins, but alternative proteins, the more I dug into it, seem to be just too big a category. It includes all sorts of fun stuff like insect-based proteins. I remember scheming through a business plan for an insect protein business 10 or 11 years ago with a friend. We'll come back to that a bit later. But anyway, it just became such a big category that I thought, let's actually focus on plant-based proteins and try and do this tortured field some justice. You'll see why it's tortured in a moment. One of the other things that we're going to try and do in this episode is we're going to kind of try to dissect a sustainability technology innovation. And I think that plant-based protein is a technology innovation. It's an engineered product. It is technology. And so the arc that we're going to try and go through is why this technology? Why did it make sense? We're going to talk a bit about then where things went wrong. We're going to talk a bit about what are the opportunities to bring it back or that it can explore. And then we're going to maybe end with some predictions. Plant-based proteins sort of exploded onto the scene, I want to say 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. And the two big juggernauts that emerged were very quickly Impossible with the Impossible Burger and Beyond with Beyond Meat. Both these companies had this amazing, very typical, I would say, tech boom cycle where they sort of got liftoff from a crowded cluster of competitors. They managed to get huge valuations, raise phenomenal amounts of money, billions of dollars, either IPO or raise on private markets, and just have this massive trajectory. And a lot of that money flowed through into engineering, creating a better product. We're going to talk a little bit more about what a better product means, but also trying to create brand. And then what happened is that suddenly it's almost like the mood changed and plant-based proteins were out, basically. And you started to see revenue declines for both these companies. You started to see market share not really appearing in the same way, lots of challenges, and key markets, particularly North America, start to either stagnate or decline for these players. In parallel, there was actually like similar stuff happening, I would say, with some other brands that were very sustainability focused or had a sustainability narrative that they were built around. The one I think about is Allbirds, now apparently an AI company, but that's a story for another episode. And so actually like just money started flowing away, share prices started crashing, NASDAQ delistings started to loom. And suddenly what seemed to be for a little while, for a brief moment in time, a very promising category now looks more or less dead to the naked eye. So I want to jump into why this became such a complicated space to win. So I think the first problem really is that both of these, I think whenever you kind of want to win something, the first problem is like, how are you defining where you're going to play? What the territory is that you want to win in. Now, both these companies, Impossible and Beyond, and I don't want to talk just about these two, I want to talk about the broader plant-based category, but they're very representative of the plant-based category, so let's roll with it. Both these companies really set up the consumer meat space as the space that they wanted to dominate, which means that they wanted to be in restaurants in place of the meat patty and the burger. And they wanted to be on grocery store shelves, again, in place of the sort of frozen steak you might buy and take home, or the frozen burger or sausage you might buy and take home. And they wanted to be mainstream. They're not trying to compete for like the premium prestige thing. They're trying to compete for the mainstream source of protein for the average person eating meat. And at some point, I think they started to talk about not just the average person eating meat, but the average person not eating meat, the plant-based eater. Now, as it happened, I was not eating meat at the time that these companies were going through their hype cycle, and I'm still not eating meat today. And I remember having this sort of conversation with a friend of mine, which was that, here's a product that is looking to taste and feel like meat, and that is the value proposition. And they want, as part of their market, people like me and my friend who don't eat meat to be their customer. But actually, we've already reconciled with the fact that we're no longer going to be eating things that taste and feel like meat. And we're sort of now grossed out by that. Like we left it for a reason. We've moved on. And we're actually now quite happy eating also maybe a little healthier. We're valuing different things in the food we eat. We're glad we're moved away from ultra processed foods. And here's an ultra processed food, and the main value prop is that you can have the taste and feel of meat. So actually, like, there's this whole customer segment of the non-meat eaters that I think already didn't really materialize for these companies. You then have the other segment, which is those who would traditionally eat meat. Now, I think here's where the problem gets really acute, which is that these companies needed to succeed on at least 4 different measures to manage to capture this sort of market. They needed to get the taste right, so it needs to taste like meat to get a meat eater to switch. You need to get the texture right, and so it needs to have that mouthy, fleshy, bloody feel that you get when you bite into some meat, I guess. The third is you needed to get the price to work, because if it's super expensive, who's going to want this fake burger? And then the fourth is you needed to get the brand right. And actually, I think that getting the brand right was the hardest thing. Not because these companies didn't manage to build great brands. I think they did. Having said that, I still can't differentiate between the two. But I think they did manage to get the general brand vibe right. But what I think people sort of miss is that meat, and actually also dairy, have some of the most powerful product brands in the world, built literally over millennia. Like, the idea of meat as a somewhat luxurious, somewhat decadent, let's say even like a macho, a manly product, something associated with strength. And like all these associations that you have with meat are not chance, right? This is branding that has been maybe developed before the concept of branding existed, right? A hunter-gatherer went out to get some meat and bring it home. And the presumption is that meat was something valuable. Someone with a cow wanted the cow because the cow gave milk, right? And this milk was good for a child, good for strong bones, good for calcium. This is all product positioning. This is all product marketing that has just developed over, we're saying thousands of years, maybe even tens of thousands of years. There was this fun moment on a speech I saw Steve Jobs was giving. And he was talking about how, like, the dairy industry, forget all of what I'm talking about, this historic stuff, but like the dairy industry in America launched one of the most powerful branding campaigns with the Got Milk campaign. And it doesn't even have to focus on the presence of the product. It's on the absence of the product, that there is no milk. And, if you just think about like how you're going to disrupt these entrenched brand moats, I think this is not something that you could have managed in 1, 2, or 3 years. You can't get parents to think that now it is better not to give their child meat and to give their child a plant-based alternative to meat overnight in 2 or 3 years with some Instagram ads. Now, on the other fronts, let's say the taste, texture, and price, I actually think that these were engineering problems, and that the industry managed to come a pretty long way to solving these engineering problems. So my favorite burger joint when I used to eat meat 8, 9 years ago was this place called Patty and Bun. And this place had a real knack for branding that didn't age well. And so they called their classic burger the Ari Gold Burger, named after a character from Entourage, which is a show that's now like 16 years old. And I remember being so excited that they had this Ari Gold Burger plant-based version. And so for the novelty, again, I'm not really into eating meat anymore, but for the novelty, I tried it. And it did taste pretty much like I remembered the meat version tasting. So like, in my opinion, at least, I think the taste and texture aspect, they got more or less right. Every year, maybe, I have one or two of these plant-based things, usually because there's nothing else available to me. Like when I travel to the Midwest in America. And I find that actually, like the way in which you grill this, the way in which you prepare it, the way in which you kind of serve it up, you can actually get one of these burgers or one of these steaks to taste, at least again to the unfamiliar taste palate, much like the real thing. So on the taste and texture, I actually think that they managed to get that right, and that was an engineering problem, and it was helped by the massive amounts of money that went into this space. On price, actually, also, they managed to make vast inroads, and I saw some data that says that actually, like, plant-based meat is now cheaper in the UK than the regular meat alternative. And I think actually there's a whole spectrum also of like quality where you could say maybe at a certain quality grade plant-based meat could be cheaper and higher quality than comparable meat alternatives. So I think actually on that front as well, as you would expect with economies of scale and again, engineering and iteration, you managed to win on that aspect. But on this final piece of the brand, I don't think this was a battle that plant-based could win very easily. The other problem is that because, and this is now more of a problem of, this is like chart of technology innovation, how it goes through these booms and then it goes through this, I think it's called the trough of despair, where basically everything dies because actually it overshot versus what the market was ready for. And it's funny, it's such a familiar pattern, but we basically fall into it every time with every tech cycle. It'll happen with AI now. We're all kind of, euphoric and using it everywhere. And then in like a year or two, you'll get this like little decline, prices go up and market tails off a bit, and then it'll come back and become mainstream. And that's sort of where we are with plant-based right now. And that means that everything has kind of all clustered all at once. So you get revenue decline because the sort of the spigot or the pipe of money pumping into branding isn't there anymore to sort of artificially prop up revenue. You get market share kind of tailing off a little because there was maybe some novelty driving adoption, particularly in North America in the last few years. And then you get share price declining as well because actually all these things sort of ripple or multiply across each other. And so the whole industry now has ended up in this slight structural decline. I remember there was a company, Meatless Farm or Meatless Farms in the UK, which is also now, I think, went into administration a couple of years ago. And so you sort of have this step back. Now, let's talk a little bit about opportunities. Where are the opportunities for this space to come back? I actually think that there are 2 or 3 interesting pockets that I see for where this space is and should and will continue to focus. One is geographically, which is quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting that as people get wealthier, they tend to eat more meat. This is like a global phenomenon, but it's also true within many countries. And so, for example, in Pakistan, as people get wealthier, they eat more meat more often, and they kind of progress up a meat value chain. At some point, it was the case that beef was seen as the cheaper entry-level meat, and chicken was seen as the more premium meat because it's smaller and therefore more expensive. And then you got battery farming, and chicken suddenly became ludicrously cheap, and then the roles reverse. But like meat tends to be this prestige good that you eat more of as you become wealthier. Another example, just so you know, my examples aren't all Pakistan. I was told once that the average Ethiopian eats 1.5 eggs a year. And that's because there's like this sort of ceremonial dish that usually has an egg in it, and they have that once a year. And beyond that, maybe there's a little bit of incidental egg consumption. But you can just kind of, see the trend from there where like as people become a little wealthier, they might eat more eggs and they might eat more meat. This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q. Where I'm going with this is if you want to sell a plant-based product, it makes sense to me that you should try and sell it to people who eat plant-based products already, rather than people who eat meat-based products, because then you don't have to compete with all this branding thing. If I'm already a vegetarian, let's say, like India has a massive number of vegetarians. If I'm already a vegetarian and I'm eating a range of plant-based things already, you don't need to convince me that this is better than a regular burger. Now, that means that your product category is going to be different. It's probably not going to be a burger or a steak, but the technology here is actually the engineering innovation. It's that you can take a plant-based product, whether it's like, fermented or treated in some other way, and you can get it to be cost and quality comparable or better on cost and quality. And actually, if you can do those things, why do you want to pick the branding fight? Go where people are already eating plant-based. It is not a surprise that one of the categories that actually seems to be doing pretty well, at least in UK grocery stores, is the whole fermented section of tempeh, and is it seitan? I'm never sure how to pronounce it. But all these categories. And I actually think like a lot of people buying these are not buying them because they would otherwise go and buy chunks of beef. They're buying them because they were probably already switching to plant-based. And this is a nice bit of variety. Like this is something a little different. And so why not add this to your regular meal, your stir fry, whereas otherwise you'd have had mushrooms and bean sprouts and all those other things that plant eaters eat. And so actually I think there was this thing about like which segment do you play for and which geography do you play for? And I think the two go quite hand in hand, actually, where it would have made more sense to me, actually, if you try to avoid the branding fight and play for where people are already eating plant-based in terms of category. So think about, for instance, things that could be added to salads, things that could be marketed to plant eaters, for instance, already. And then think about where you have high densities of people switching to plant-based diets. North America, I would say, is a pretty bad bet in this. Maybe you go for certain cities or micro niches. Europe probably getting better, but large parts of the developing world, I would argue, would have been good spaces for this to focus on. And in fact, now when you look at the growth rates of plant-based consumption, actually in these markets, the growth rates are pretty good. The other area I think that is now getting more attention is the B2B space. And actually, let's bring back insect protein for a moment. When my friend and I were doing this analysis of this insect-based business that never got off the ground, we realized that actually the product would be dirt cheap. It was basically a box with a bunch of insects in it. I'm not kidding. And at some point you heat the box to roast up those insects, and then you grind up the insects into a powder, and you've more or less got your insect protein. No disrespect to anyone in the insect protein business. I'm sure it is somewhat more complicated than that at scale, but this is kind of what we chalked out on the whiteboard. And then we realized that actually the big problem is going to be, where do you play? The same thing. How do you disrupt a brand and get people like my producers to eat insects instead of sausages? And actually we realized that that would be insane. And so instead, the two places to focus, my friend had a suggestion, I had a suggestion. My friend's suggestion was fitness freaks, because he said actually when you're going to the gym, you want a protein snack, you want the maximum amount of protein you can get per calorie, you don't really care where it comes from, and a bunch of these nuts will eat insect protein. My idea, which I came to a bit later, was actually animals. The poor buggers have no choice, no say in the matter. And actually, if you just feed them insect protein, they'll probably eat it and probably be fine. As a matter of fact, my dog ate a fly the other day and I didn't even have to bribe her. So point being, the B2B space has a lot of potential, I think, where you kind of say, well, there's like a snack bar, and can you actually feed in something that goes into the snack bar and let the person with the end consumer problem think about where do they place this. I think to an extent, insects is obviously very hard, right? Let's move away from insects. Let's move back to plant-based protein. But like selling plant-based protein into fitness snack bars has turned out, I think, to be a really good space. Actually, like pea protein is, arguably one of the biggest growth drivers right now is probably protein supplements. So the whole B2B space, I think, was actually a really good area to go into. And then things like animal feed and replacing lower value or lower quality uses of animal protein, I think is another great area to look at. So what I would expect is that in terms of kind of the opportunities to explore, you start to see this industry looking more and more at B2B. How do I sell plant-based protein at a kind of more basic raw material ingredient level into other companies that then think about the positioning and the branding and where to play and so on. As the company doing the engineering and the innovation, I don't need to try and own the whole value chain or the whole stack of the problem with also figuring out which consumers do I go and sell my product to. The next area I think is going to be interesting is when you start to try and sell, if you are selling direct or trying to monetize the consumer directly, finding consumers that already eat plant-based or are already looking for plant-based rather than those who you need to get to shift from meat. And then finally, this geographic play where you say, well, actually, which geographies are most amenable to plant-based rather than where do I want to try and force fit a narrative. Let's move on to talk about predictions, which I think follows on neatly from opportunities to play, but with one caveat. I don't know if we ever all believed that there would be a permanent future that we would arrive at where everyone would eat predominantly plant-based. But I don't think that that is happening in the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. I don't know if anyone still argues that it might. And so I think what is interesting is to say, as a prediction, I haven't actually seen the numbers on this. I think there's a temptation to say that plant-based diets on the whole should increase. On the other hand, though, I think that there's this interesting trade-off with rising incomes, where again, as you get rising incomes, you are going to get more meat consumption. And so there's a question which is, does the rate at which consumers shift from meat to plant-based in London, Paris, Copenhagen, Berlin, etc., does that add more plant consumption or displace more meat consumption versus people getting wealthier in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Indonesia and Nigeria and therefore moving to meat? Like, how do these numbers match up? And I actually would put my money on more meat eaters entering the spectrum as people get wealthier. I think in certain pockets of certain geographies, you will see plant-based continue to catch up. I think that plant-based burgers and plant-based steaks, frankly, will always be a fringe thing. And I think that's because they have this, this weird counter product positioning where you have to have known the original product to want to switch. And therefore you lose one slice of the market. The branding of the original product is really strong, and so you're just really climbing uphill. Having said that, like oat milk could be one good counterexample where you say, well, oat milk seems to be having a pretty long-term sustained tear. And, the same argument could be true for dairy. So maybe I'm wrong, but I would imagine, I personally would think that actually these things remain consigned to the fringe. And then I think that the interesting uses where I think actually demand will grow will be a lot of B2B stuff, a lot of the protein that we don't think about but still consume. So fitness bars, protein supplements, snacks, maybe even baked items. You could see a lot of the lower level baked items, for instance, starting to use plant-based protein rather than dairy and eggs and other real eggs and other such. I think from a pricing segment perspective, I think that the engineering innovation will continue to drive price down in a way that you can't drive prices down for meat and dairy and eggs in the same way. There's only so much space you can squeeze a chicken into, bless her, bless it, bless him. Not sure there. But, whereas with this engineered product, you can kind of keep driving it down lower and lower and lower. And as the scale grows, you can keep driving it further lower. So I do think that particularly in the let's say, lower order of items, and by lower order of items, I mean items that are served to lower income markets, items where the protein is less valuable. So again, like a mass market store bread, any eggs used in it are not very valuable versus a 6-pack of eggs you buy for the eggs themselves. And so I think this sort of lower order uses will see plant-based uptake as the price becomes cheaper and cheaper and allows companies to save money. And then I think that you'll start to see localized players in emerging markets. As the technology becomes commoditized, I think you'll start to see, for instance, more and more, let's say, players in India say, well, hey, let's take this amazing technology that companies like Impossible and Beyond have pioneered. Let's translate it and let's make like a local variant of food using this same thing that plays very well with the local palate and the local taste. So I think you'll start to see a lot of that as the technology becomes more ubiquitous. So I'm long-term bullish on plant-based. I think the question is kind of where do they play? How do they play? There's a question on what the technology would be as well, which we haven't really touched on. But I would say you could argue there's kind of lab-based tissue culture. There's fermentation. I'm sure there's a couple of others that I'm missing. I actually think you could see all of these do reasonably well in different markets as long as you can find the right match of the market segment to the technology. So overall, I think that we will get out of this trough or this valley of death. But I think that the players that end up winning will probably look different to what we might have expected 6 or 7 years ago. It won't be like the winning mass players won't be winning because they managed to get a burger on the shelf that looks and tastes like meat. They'll be winning because they have technology that is cheaper and has found the right niches to get to the consumer through. So hope you enjoyed this episode of State of Sustainability. If you liked this episode and want to see more of our little deep dives on different tech within the sustainability space, please drop me a DM. LinkedIn is great. Otherwise, email me. My email is in the notes, saf@altruistic.com. And if you have a particular technology that you would love for us to consider or deep dive into, please give me the suggestion. Always happy to receive it. And if you liked this episode, please hit follow so you never miss the next one. We always appreciate a review or at the very least sharing this with a friend. And so until next time, thank you very much.